Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, Thomas R. Weaver, talking about his novel, Artificial Wisdom. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Worldshapers podcast, where I talk to other authors about their latest books. My name is Edward Willett, as you can see right there on the screen. Oh, it's over there. And I am also an author of science fiction and fantasy and nonfiction, many books. My most recent novel is The Tangled Stars, which came out from Daw Books in late 2022. It is a far future outer space adventure featuring an AI-uplifted talking cat who becomes a starship captain. It does have an element of humor, as you might guess from that description. It's an audiobook and ebook. There's no print version, but you can find it in audiobook and ebook, and I hope that you will. I am also a publisher. My publishing company is called Shadowpaw Press. This is the point at which I always like to plug the latest books from Shadowpaw Press. It's named after our cat, in case you're wondering where the name came from. So, most recent one, and the one that's probably the biggest one right now for me, is The Downloaded by Robert J. Sawyer. This is his 25th novel. He, of course, is a Hugo and Nebula award-winning author, Canada's best-known science fiction author. This is available now in print. It started life as an audiobook original with Brendan Fraser in the cast from Audible. So, it's a great little book, a great little science fiction, I say little book. It's not little in its ideas, but it's little in its length. It's less than 200 pages. And I hope that you'll check it out. Another one that just came out recently, in fact, we had a joint book launch in Calgary for the two of them, is this one, The Traitor's Son, from Dave Duncan. Dave Duncan is no longer with us, unfortunately. He died in 2018. This was the book he was awaiting edits on when he died, edited by Dr. Robert Runte for publication. And it's also a science fiction adventure, and I hope you'll check that one out as well. So it's set on a colony where everything that could go wrong, colony world where everything that could go wrong, has gone wrong, or is about to go wrong. And the son of this traitor, the traitor's son, is the only one who perhaps can save everyone. This one came out a little earlier in the year. It's called The Good Soldier by Nir Yaniv. He's an Israeli-born author living in Los Angeles, a filmmaker as well. And this is, and a musician. This is a military science fiction satire. You can think of it as Catch-22 in outer space or MASH meets Starship Troopers, something along those lines. It's set in a kind of mobile infantry setting, but it's not really about that. It's a military satire, anti-military, I guess you could say in many ways. Anyway, check it out. The Good Soldier. It's a very funny book. I like it as well. And also out at about the same time as that one was this young adult science fiction dystopian novel called The Headmasters, post-apocalyptic as well in a way. Something goes horribly wrong at a research facility in northern Ontario, and alien parasites appear out of nowhere and attach themselves to the people who live there. The rest of the world seems to have gone silent. So this is actually quite a long time after those events, and it's a girl who's growing up under those conditions and how she finds a way to perhaps fight back. And then finally, this one also came out a little earlier this year, Shapers of Worlds Volume 4. It's the fourth anthology that I've kickstarted featuring authors who were guests on this podcast. This one has a list of great authors. You can see them there. And it's also illustrated by Calgary artist Wendy Nordell. So I recommend this one too, obviously. And I just kickstarted Volume 5, so that'll be out later this year to backers and out to the general public in the new year. Okay, that's my introductory plugs for everything that's going on right now. So let's get on to this episode's guest, Thomas R. Weaver. And I will, of course, put on my reading glasses so that I can read his bio, because otherwise I don't have a prayer at my age. Thomas R. Weaver writes stories about tomorrow to help make sense of today. Aside from writing, Thomas is a UK-based tech entrepreneur. His last startup was acquired by Just Eat Takeaway, and his new one is still in stealth, but backed by a major Silicon Valley tech accelerator. After successfully launching a tech startup in the restaurant hospitality space, which transformed payment and ordering experiences, he realized he had no more excuses not to do what he always wanted to do, write fiction. Despite swearing to friends and family, none of whom apparently believed him, that he'd never run another startup again, he recently started another one focused on bringing some of the ideas in Artificial Wisdom, which is the book we'll be talking about, his debut novel, to life, specifically around communicating in augmented reality. In Thomas's spare time, he has some, amazingly enough, he is an avid cook and loves drawing, painting, and chess. He usually writes immediately after a workout and spa session down at his local gym. Thomas collects more books than he has time to read, especially if they have beautiful covers like folio editions. He's a sucker for great covers. And now we're going to talk to Thomas about his latest book, Artificial Wisdom. Let's meet him now. So, Tom, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Thank you.
Now, you're in the UK and I'm in Saskatchewan, and well, yes, we just had a little issue over timing there that we've now worked out, so that's good. I always have that problem because we don't change time here and everybody else changes around us, so it's happened before. But anyway, here we are, and looking forward to talking with you about your new novel. But first, let's talk about you. You have an interesting background among the writers I have spoken to. So tell me about yourself, where you grew up, and how you got started doing what you have done leading up to this time when you became a writer.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be on the show. So I'm British. You might be able to tell from the accent. I have worked in technology for quite a long time. I had my own startup, and I was very fortunate. I think I was one of those lucky people that was able to actually sell the startup before it kind of disappeared into nothingness. So many people don't make it in this space. It's a very, very tricky space, especially once you've raised a lot of money. There's a lot of pressure. So I was very lucky. We were able to sell just before the pandemic. And I had reached a place where I thought, well, you know what? I don't really have the excuse that I've always kind of used for why I'm not writing, which was I always thought I can't really write because writers don't make any money. And so
I can vouch for that.
Yeah. So I had to wait until I've made some money before I can write. And then I didn't really have that excuse anymore. So I decided now was the time, and I could do what I'd always dreamed of doing.
So you've always dreamed of doing it. Did you write, start writing as a kid? You must have been a big reader, because that's what, look at the books behind you, because that's what usually leads into writing.
So I think I like to credit Roald Dahl with me wanting to become a writer, and certainly the BFG has this section in it where Sophie, the little girl, basically experiences this dream where she's written a book and it's so good that people can't put it down. Mm-hmm. And people are crashing cars and walking into each other on the street, and they just can't put it down. And I remember thinking, I'd love to write something so good that people can't put it down. And that really stayed with me. I tried to write a terrible, it was a fantasy ripoff, I think, when I was 12. I was reading things like Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara when I was a young teenager, which in itself was a ripoff of Tolkien.
Yes.
And so, I wrote my ripoff of the ripoff of Tolkien, and then didn't touch really writing for 30 years. And so it was an interesting kind of restart, because you kind of obviously you have to teach yourself how to write before you can write anything. You need to, just because you read doesn't mean that actually you know anything about writing. So there was a very quick education process that I needed to go through, and I invested quite heavily in making sure that I didn't get to the end of a manuscript and then realize how much work it needed. I wanted to make sure I figured out how to write before I wrote too much. And so, yeah.
Presumably, although you were not writing fiction, I would think in your line of work there would have been a lot of writing, as in putting your thoughts on, I was going to say paper, but that's just because I'm old. So do you think that at least the process of organizing your thoughts and making things happen carried over to the fiction writing when you decided to make that leap?
I think so. Obviously, yeah, you're right. I mean, you're running any business, you're writing a lot of stuff, and you're learning how to use persuasive language, you're learning to clarify thoughts, you're learning to articulate, not to mention the basics, the spelling and the grammar and everything else, which you just can't afford to not get right. But I think actually, learning to write fiction is very different. And part of that is because you're trying to not write with your own voice, you're trying to really write with the voice of the character. And learning how to do that, learning how to get into the heads of the different characters and make sure that you were representing the world through what they were seeing. That was, I think, the biggest step up that I needed to make, and I think most amateur writers do as well. When you start, you're kind of just using an author voice, and you don't kind of understand about things like head hopping and other stuff. So, learning how to really get deeply inside somebody's mind, and to color the words that you're using with how they perceive the world. Yeah, that was the challenging bit.
So did you work with somebody or take lessons or formal training of some sort?
Yeah, all of the above, I think. So I took a writing coach who's a wonderful author called Mark Leggett. He's the author of a Scottish crime thriller called Penitent, and a bunch of other books. Mark was great because I could work with him as I went along. I could send him chapters, and he could school me on those chapters as I was going, rather than getting 100,000 words in and then trying to figure it all out. So that was great, and he taught me things like point of view, very, very early on, very quickly, and helped me understand some of the techniques and tools of the craft. I read 100 books on writing, listened to some wonderful podcasts, Writing Excuses, for example.
Oh, I know that one, yeah.
Just wonderful. I devoured, hundreds of episodes of that, and watched masterclasses and all these sorts of things. And I still do, actually, because I think that even though I've, my first book is out, I've got a, finished draft of a second book. I'm starting on other projects now. I think that you need to continually keep reminding yourself of tools and techniques and things to know. So I don't really ever plan to stop learning.
Now, you talked about, writing in other people's voices and understanding the characters. I would think, again, going back through all of what you've done leading up to when you started writing, you would have met a lot of interesting characters and been exposed to a lot of different people. Do you think that sort of general knowledge of how the world works has really fed into this book, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute, but it is kind of a near future book, and it deals in politics and business and all that sort of things. Do you think your life experience has really helped you in writing the book that you chose to write?
Definitely. I mean, again, it was interesting, at age 12, my view of what I could write was fantasy. And I guess that was because as a 12-year-old, you have no life experience. And so the idea of a made up world is much more appealing. And certainly through my 20s, I was very much a reader of fantasy, and I love that kind of genre. And then as I got a bit older, and I wanted to read a lot of other stuff, and even in my teenagers I did, but that wasn't what I was addicted to. But I read very, very widely, and of course, more things about the world, and you're able to bring those experiences to the table. I would say I didn't really bring any particular character from my life to the table. The characters almost, you start with an idea, and you start with, okay, this is the kind of person I want, and then they need to grow. In my view, they need to grow off the page themselves, rather than being representations of people that but certainly a lot of the ideas, a lot of the plot ideas, a lot of the things that people think and go through, they would be driven from things I've seen and observed and think about a lot in my own life.
Well, the book is called Artificial Wisdom, and this probably would be a good place to give a little bit of a description of what it's about without giving away anything you don't want to give away in the terms of how the plot turns out.
Sure. So Artificial Wisdom, show for those of you looking on YouTube later, this is the UK paperback, although we've just released in hardback in the US. Artificial Wisdom is a murder mystery techno-thriller. It's set in the year 2050, and it is full of, climate change and AI themes, let's say, where the main character, Marcus Tully, is an investigative journalist who discovers that his wife, who died in a huge climate disaster 10 years before, may have actually been more than that. It may have been victim of a geo-engineering disaster that has been covered up. And they're in the midst of the biggest election of all time, which is an election for a position of global dictator, somebody to step in and to take control with a mandate to fix all the problems connected with the kind of the climate, and essentially look at how things can be fixed when individual nations can't make certain hard choices. And one of those candidates is an artificially intelligent candidate, which I think is very apt today when you think of even last night, as we record this episode, there was a bunch of new announcements from the biggest AI companies and things are moving very, very fast. So I wanted to look ahead to that age of potential super intelligence, but also to tell a story that wasn't really the classic kind of, HAL in 2001 or, the Terminator or anything else. I didn't want killer robots. I wanted to explore how technology could potentially solve our problems and what the consequences, what the price we'd have to pay for using it would be. Because I think that these things are never easy. I always talk about the smartphone, for example, as being something that has completely transformed our life. We can get a taxi to wherever we are from our phone, and we can connect with people in real time wherever we are. But it has also stolen our attention, and there's a bunch of prices that we pay with every technology that comes along that allows us to do something differently. And that was one of the things I wanted to explore on a much larger scale.
When you decided you wanted to write, was this idea already bubbling around in the back of your head, or was that something that, as you started, well, I would like to write, now what am I going to write, that these ideas started to come to you? Or had this been sort of there for a while?
It had been there for at least 6 months, and certainly some of the inspirations have been bubbling around. I'm particularly concerned about things like political polarization, like how, as we're moving apart, actually it becomes much easier to manipulate us. And so a lot of these ideas have been in my head. When I decided I was going to write, I actually wrote 5 ideas down, and I sent just short paragraphs, 5 ideas, and I sent them to my former co-founder of the business that we just sold. And I said, "Hey, look, I'm thinking of writing. Which one of these should I write?" And he kind of, I always need input. I mean, this is part and parcel of having a co-founder. It was always good to have people to bounce things off. So he went through all the ideas and he added his comments. And the one he came back and said, this is the one you should write was this one. It was artificial wisdom. The others were very different. And it's interesting because I think once you've written that first book, then suddenly you are a little bit fixed in, people are going to want a second book that is not too far distant from that first one. So in a way, that's the career choice right there. I'm going to be writing books like this one, techno-thrillers. I would say light sci-fi. I'm not going to be writing spaceships and aliens, very hard stuff of people orbiting planets 5,000 years from now. I want this to be kind of accessible, but futuristic fiction.
But what happens to some writers, including happened to me, is that I started writing science fiction, and then the publisher said, fantasy is selling better right now. We want to keep publishing you, but would you write fantasy? And, oh, by the way, would you change your name? So I had a couple of pseudonyms in there before I went back to Edward Willett. So, yeah, that can happen, too, because people do expect a certain thing from what they see the first time they see your name on a book, for sure.
Yeah.
So you worked with a book coach, as you said. As you developed this idea, did you do a detailed outline of it, or was it you started writing and figured it out as you went?
There was a very detailed outline, but I think I'm somewhere in the middle. When we think of that spectrum between outliners and discovery writers, I'm somewhere in the middle in that I need the North Star. I need to know exactly where things are going to be ending up, but I don't outline in incredible detail, at least for that first draft. What tends to happen is I get a few drafts in, and then I do the outline in detail as I'm replotting it. But this is complicated. The plot of Artificial Wisdom, it is a complicated one. It is very convoluted. There's a lot of twists and turns. There is a mystery at the core of it. I needed to know the story behind the story in a lot of detail. And so that was really what I mapped out. I didn't really map out the kind of chapter by chapter synopsis or the scene by scene. I very much mapped out, this is what's really happening. And then, I was able to always use that as my reference point when I'm actually going through the story. I guess you learn from these things. My second book that I'm sort of in the process of writing at the moment, I actually did as a NaNoWriMo project, which is this competition for your listeners who don't know, but it's the one where in November you try and write 50,000 words, and I did it, but basically I decided to write it the day before NaNoWriMo started, so I hadn't got any outline or any idea, and in some ways it was great because it came out really fresh, and it was quite nice to hit 50,000 words in a month after after the process of writing up my first book, which was very convoluted. Having said that, because I didn't have that North Star of an ending, by the time I hit my second draft, had to cull almost the final third of the novel because I didn't like where it ended. And even now I'm on draft 6. I've had alpha readers read it and love it, but I'm still not happy with that ending. And the changes I'm making now to the story behind the story require so much unpicking and everything else. I'm literally writing my outline. So, I guess I don't have it nailed yet as to what my process is. I know I'm not a full outliner, but I know there's benefits from doing so. I guess I'll learn every time I write a book and figure out the new best way for me, and then get to the end of it and go, why did I ever do it like that?
Yeah, I hear that a lot on here, actually. You're really talking about world building and that sort of figuring out what's going on in the world around the story before you have the detailed plot of the story necessarily. And this podcast is called The Worldshapers, so thank you for that. That worked right into the title of the podcast. Was there a lot of research involved because you are dealing with near future and you have to extrapolate technology, especially in AI, obviously, and geo-engineering and all those sorts of things? Did it require a lot of research?
It did, but I'm a research as you go kind of person. I didn't sit down. I always listen to these wonderful things like Ken Follett did a talk for BBC recently where he talks about how, in order to write some historical fiction, he will spend a year, researching before he even puts pen to paper. I just wouldn't have the patience for that. I mean, full credit to him, is incredible, but I just couldn't do it. I'm very much a little bit more like Aaron Sorkin, the director, who basically says, when he's writing characters for The West Wing, those characters have no backstory until they hit the page and they need backstory, and then he invents the backstory for those people. I think that's a little bit more me. I would go and think, okay, I need technology to do this. What exists today that is related to that? How can I take that idea and evolve that idea? Where is that likely to be? And I would do grounded research on a kind of topic by topic basis. It's amazing really how much technology, sometimes even the things that you haven't heard of, really still exist. You think you have an idea and you're like, it'd be really good if instead of having, perfume in the future that you spray on, people could take a pill. And then you start to look into it and you're like, yeah, that exists already. People are researching these things. So, okay, how does it work at the moment? Where does it fall down? And that sometimes gives you plot ideas that you can take on. So obviously a lot of things from a technology perspective, a lot of things I know myself and was able to delve straight in, and some things I knew nothing about or was not sophisticated. I wouldn't say I knew them in enough detail to be comfortable. There was some bits around currency and imagining kind of future versions of cryptocurrency where I would have calls with some crypto experts to help talk me through it and to find some of the potential security risks and fraud risks of cryptocurrency, and where is the holes in these things that I can exploit from a plot point. Or I talk to people who specialize in augmented reality, Robert Scoble in the US, in Silicon Valley, saying, okay, how do I make sure that I don't rely on screens in this book? Because it seems crazy to me that every sci-fi in the world relies on screens, and yet we know that screens may not be here in 20, 30 years time. So how do I make sure that I don't write a single real physical screen into my book? That kind of level of research, I think, was really important.
And I think what I've always found doing that kind of research, because I tend to be the same way, as I research what I need to as I come to it. Like, oh, I need a small personal submarine. Well, it's time to go find out what exists in that field. And I found it, so it was cool. Yeah. But what I also find is that once you have those research details, then suddenly it will open up new possibilities in the story because, oh, this exists, I can use it this way, or this affects the story that way. Did you get that kind of serendipitous pleasure from your research?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the greatest feelings about writing. People sometimes say, why do you write? And I think we all know that at times writing can be painful. You can be sat there going, oh my God, this is like, it's just chaos in my brain and it's not coming out and the words are torture. And, sometimes it's difficult. But those moments when you're working on an idea and you've done some of the research and you found a nugget of gold in there, and you're suddenly hit with ooh, that's a great way of solving that. And that brush, I mean, it's unlike anything else. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's some wonderful things that can come out that you just don't expect to come out, and then you're like, that's really, really good. I'm going to use that. And then if you can find a way of tying it in multiple ways, so it's not just the one thing, but it looks like you've really planned it, and you can really tuck it into the early stages of the story, then it becomes great.
I just saw a cartoon yesterday of a writer who's writing. She says the character sat at his desk, and then she looks up, what kind of wood did they make desks out of in 12th century Japan? And then 6 hours later, the character sits at his cypress desk.
Yes.
She carries on.
Yes, this has actually happened to me. I mean, I was researching for a different book, like for a sequel. I was looking at, a character in Baghdad, but I wanted him to go down into a cellar, into like a sub level kind of speakeasy. And then I was like, well, do they have cellars levels in Baghdad today? Okay, what's the architecture of the region? Like, what stone is it? Okay, he's going down steps. What kind of stone do they have? And yeah, you can spend out, and yeah, you're right. It comes out as like one word. Okay, is that kind of stone slippy or not? I would say this is actually where, I mean, AI is a really, really tricky topic in writing right now, and it's very controversial. I would say that AI has helped me in this regard from a research perspective, because I'm able to find out some answers a lot faster than I ever could have done on Google. As an example, I was working on one small thing in my second book where a character gets, there's an injury. Let's just say there's an injury. Somebody loses a limb, and you need an emergency tourniquet. And so I started to type into Google and looking up stuff around emergency tourniquets. I'm not in a hospital. I don't have a real kind of tourniquet in front of me. And it was really challenging, because every single thing that I was looking up was talking about all the things I shouldn't do. And it was almost like just too much information. And after maybe 10 minutes of looking around, I hadn't found a satisfactory answer. So I logged on to ChatGPT and I said, I'm in an emergency. Somebody's arm's been cut off. I haven't got access to proper tourniquet equipment. Tell me the quickest thing that would come to that I could possibly get my hands on in a kitchen that would allow me to use this as a tourniquet. And it gave me an answer. And it gave me an answer instantly, because it thought I was in an emergency. and then I did research around that answer, and it was a great answer. So that was what I ended up using in my book. And that's where I think AI as a research tool is going to really transform things, or at least speed things up for writers, isn't it? It's not got all the answers. You can't expect it to write for you. You shouldn't expect it to write for you, but it can be a great tool.
And I know you did some research around it, because AI can also hallucinate things, we've discovered.
Yeah, you have to double check these things.
Yeah. So how long did it take once you decided you're going to write this novel? And it was your first one, so there must have been probably a slower process than it is now. As you're writing now, are you a fast writer? I mean, you did NaNoWriMo, so clearly you can churn out a lot of words in a month.
Yeah, I don't think I am a fast writer. I mean, yes, you can. You're right. You can churn out words, but I think the stories I'm trying to tell are sufficiently convoluted that I need a lot of thinking time. And if I haven't done the thinking time, sometimes it doesn't all add up. And so, artificial wisdom itself, I started writing, as many people did, in 2020, early 2020, as I couldn't go outside anymore and do the things I wanted to do. And I mean, we published it in 2023. And there was editing fairly up to the last minute, at least until the audiobook narrator was kind of in the production studio, and we were still tweaking kind of words here and words there. After that point, you think, well, it's set in stone now. Mm-hmm. What it is, it is. It's not going to change it. My second book, as I say, I thought I was done. Actually, I had within a year, I had a draft that people loved. It just so turned out that I'm not happy with it. I don't love it. So they love it. And my wife couldn't put it down. All my alpha readers were like, this reads even better than your first book. But maybe the ideas aren't quite as big. And I'm just not happy with it. So it's maybe it's a perfectionist. I'm like, okay, if I tear out the beginning and I tear out the end and make some tweaks in the middle, I think I can do it better. And so whilst I thought it was going to be a much quicker process, as I say, because I didn't have that same North Star when I started it, I think it's going to be maybe another 6 months of playing around. And I go through spurts. There's spurts where I'm writing heavily and I'm really into it and I'm really doing a lot. And then I need, maybe three weeks break where I'm thinking about it, but actually that break in your brain, having the space to not think about it, means when I come back to it, I think it tends to be slightly better than it was.
You mentioned alpha readers. Where did you find these people?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to use people I know. I mean, I'm fortunate that a lot of the people around me are readers, and also that certainly from an alpha reader perspective, I know a lot of people who will tell me the truth. They won't caveat things. My wife is French. She's very blunt. She would tell me if she didn't. There have definitely been bits in the book where she's like, "Yeah, this is not good," as you're writing it, And so it's good to know which bits to fix. And I can also see. I love having my wife in particular as an alpha reader because, when she gasps aloud, I can walk over and look at what page she gasped on, or when she snaps the book shut, I'm like, okay, what just annoyed you about that? It's like having a real live kind of experience, a very expressionable experience in front of you. So I tended to use wider friends and family, but I also used a lot of editors. I like having different points of view. So whilst I had Mark, my writing coach, who was also my primary editor really during the process, I worked with a bunch of other people as well, and we would find people off Readsy or really good editors that we knew, and we'd put it in front of them because sometimes you're just too close to it. Even Mark, as my writing coach, was just too close to it, and we needed people who could take a step back and read it fresh and go, okay, here's where some of the problems are. And I think that immeasurably improved things. Those kind of rounds of feedback, it made it a lot more complicated because you've got lots of different thoughts and ideas and feedback, and you don't know which ones to take and not to take sometimes. And each one comes through with a different problem, and you can spend forever fixing things, and it's not always correct. So try to filter through that and go, okay, I agree with that, but not that. That was a learning process. But each of those people that did read my book and give me detailed markups on my manuscript immeasurably helped me improve what I did. It was invaluable.
So the book came out in 2023. Have you been pleased with the response to it? Are readers finding in it what you hoped they would find in it?
Yeah. As with all these things, getting a new book out to market can be challenging. I would say the biggest thing for me has been actually in the last few days where there's this wonderful pair of TikTok influencers, two sisters, Kristen and Maddie, who reviewed the book and loved it. And I don't think I've ever seen anyone as enthusiastic about a book. And they had like 80,000 followers on TikTok, and I'm watching their review as we speak. It's got 120,000 views in the last 15 hours. And I think that the views aside, seeing how much they loved it, that makes it all worthwhile. I'm
afraid you won't get that number of views on this podcast, unfortunately. But
that's okay. Every single, it only takes one person who loves the book. That's my theory. But when you discover somebody that really enjoys it, that makes it worthwhile. It is hard to find them. Every author knows it's hard to find the numbers. If you're not in that top, 1% of traditional authors who are being, marketed with a significant amount of money, then it's very difficult for your book to be found. But those that have read it, on the whole, really enjoy it. If you're the type of reader that enjoys this kind of stuff, and I'm seeing a lot of comparisons on TikTok to other authors, people like Blake Crouch, who wrote Dark Matter. It just came out on Apple TV. But it's not for everyone, and sometimes you get feedback that, okay, this bit was too slow, or this bit didn't work for me. I did a book club last night, and it was wonderful. I absolutely enjoyed it because a bunch of people who want to spend an hour and a half talking about your book. I mean, that's an incredible privilege. But there was one old lady in there, and she was, she was 80 years old, and she was wonderful. But you could tell it just wasn't for her. And one of the first things she said was, I felt that the book was just a bit overpopulated with too many characters. And I don't think you needed as many characters to do this. And she kept coming back to it as we were going through. And yeah, this character, I don't think this character was right. And I was like, okay, it just doesn't land with everyone, and I'm okay with that. I know that I can't please everyone. As I said to her, I grew up reading fantasy, and if you've read The Wheel of Time, which is something like 700 unique points of view, you're never going to think my book is overpopulated with characters. In fact, I saw on TikTok an epic fantasy fan who was like, "Hey, this is a really good short read." And I was thinking, short read? This is like 120,000 words, but compared to epic fantasy, which can now weigh in at 400,000, 500,000 words for a Brandon Sanderson book. Yeah, it's a short novella palate cleanser. So everybody's different. You've just got to find the people who are going to love your book.
And what are you working on now? I mean, you've already said you're working on a second book. So what is that?
Well, I started writing on the second book even before I finished Artificial Wisdom, because we were slightly worried that maybe Artificial Wisdom was going to be too dark. Did people want to be thinking about these existential threats of, the climate and AI and everything else? And so I say we, me and my writing coach, because we talk about these things kind of daily. Was this book was the book I wanted to write, but it might not be what people wanted to read. So even before we got this one out the door, I started to work on a second one, so that if the first one failed, I hadn't already given up, and that's a principle I hold to often in my life. It's like, okay, how do I make sure I'm keeping going? So the second book is still sci-fi. It is a sci-fi noir. It is a bit more of an action thriller, and I wanted to write something which wasn't too hardcore sci-fi. It felt like an action thriller that could take place in our world. It just happened to be in a sci-fi environment. So the idea I have is an intergenerational colony ship that's been traveling for, at this point, 600 years. It was only meant to be 500 years. It never arrived. It didn't arrive on time. And therefore the generations that have grown up, it's kind of fallen into something of a dystopia. And things are crumbling apart. And my main character, though, it's nothing to do with the situation of what's happening on deck. They're living their lives. She is what I'm calling a fixer. She is paid to wade into other people's problems, sometimes with her fists. And she's paid at the beginning of the book to help sort out a predatory neighbor of a woman, and that happens to spin into a much bigger, more convoluted plot. So very, very different. I see it as having interesting series potential. I really like the female main character I got in it, but it was very deliberately a less convoluted, more straightforward action thriller book than my first book. And now I've kind of got to the end of it. I'm thinking, okay, it really works, but people really like my first book, so I kind of want to make sure that people that like the first book also like the second book. And so I'm going back and layering in a lot more stuff and a lot more twists and turns.
Does it have a title yet?
It's called Futility Town. Yeah, I'll show you. This is an exclusive because I don't normally show it. That's going to be the cover of the second book. Yeah, I always like to have a cover in mind because it helps me visualize it. I know it's normally quite, normally that never happens, right? I mean, it's part of the advantage of being an independent publisher. Is that I can send early drafts of these things to my cover designer. I can go, hey, this is what I'm thinking of, give me some ideas, and we work through the concepts, and then that just helps me visualize it. And if I picture something on my shelf, it gives me the impetus to keep writing it and to get it done.
Do you have a projected release date, or is it too soon for that?
Definitely too soon. I thought I was going to have it out in September this year, and if I'd have been happy with the alpha version, it could have been out in September this year. I think it will be next year now sometime. Yeah.
Where can people keep up with you online and find out, when this next one comes out and more about the last one and about you?
Well, I have a website, thomasrweaver.com, but I think probably the best place is for me right now. I mean, TikTok has suddenly become huge for me, and I never really thought it would be. So I'm on TikTok a lot. I'm on Instagram, although less. And if you want to chat more to me day to day, I'm on things like Threads and Twitter and everything else, really. But certainly I see myself investing more time in TikTok and in Threads than anything else. But people can always email me. As I say, my website, thomasrweaver.com. It's there, and all the links to buy the books are there too.
And the website would have links to all of your various social media accounts as well, I presume?
Yes, it does.
Because they will also appear on the webpage for this episode on theworldshapers.com.
Wonderful.
Once it goes live. Yeah, so, well, that's great. I'm glad this new direction you've gone from what you had been doing and going into writing seems to be working out. And are you happy you've made that choice, that you started writing finally after all these years?
Yeah, I'm delighted. As I say, that dream of writing something that somebody couldn't put down. I might not be there yet on the scale that Sophie had in BFG, where everybody in the world couldn't put it down. But I know that there's been a few people that couldn't put it down, and that's enough for me right now. So I'm very, very happy.
Well, thanks so much for being on. I really enjoyed the chat. I hope you did as well.
I did. Thank you.
Best of luck.
Thank you.
And thanks again to Tom for that great chat. That was very interesting, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. That brings us to the end of another episode of The Worldshapers. Just the usual housekeeping things to remind you of. First of all, that you can find The Worldshapers online at theworldshapers.com. You can find it on Twitter X, at The Worldshapers, and on Facebook at The Worldshapers. You can find me online at edwardwillett.com. That's how you spell my name. It's right there. You can find me on X at ewillett. You can find me on Facebook at edward.willett. You can find me on Instagram at edwardwillettauthor, all one word. You can find me on YouTube, which you very well may have if you're watching this on YouTube, at youtube.com/edwardwillett. And what have I forgotten? YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, X. I guess those are the biggies. Maybe I didn't forget anything. That's all the places, some of the places you can find me. I'm in a few other places as well, but those are some of them. And you can always find the other places by my website. Also, I am a publisher, as I said. You can find my publishing company, Shadowpaw Press, at shadowpawpress.com. You can find it on X at Shadowpaw Press, and you can find it on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press, and you can find it on Facebook at Shadowpaw Press, because when I did all those, I finally managed to adhere to the old axiom that you should always use the same handle on all of your social media. So now that I've talked to Tom Weaver in this episode, maybe I'll be on TikTok. We'll see if I can figure out a way to make that happen. But I'm not there yet. That's it for this time around. I hope that you will come back in the future as I continue to talk to authors about their latest books, and I'll see you next time.